Welcome to Horror Echo. Hello everyone. I'm here to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. But before you do, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is where you're watching. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown. The whispering shadows in the woods. The rain drummed softly against the window, the rhythmic tapping almost soothing in its consistency. But there was something else in the air tonight, a heavy, unnerving silence that seemed to hang between the thunderclaps. The kind of quiet you only find in the middle of nowhere. Lindsay had always loved hiking through the woods near her home in the small town of Mill Hollow. It was a peaceful, almost eerie place where the trees towered over the trails like ancient sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. She'd spent hours exploring, lost in her thoughts, with only the rustling leaves and occasional bird call breaking the stillness. But tonight, something felt different. It had started with a sudden shift in the air, cooler, heavier, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Lindsay tried to shake off the unease that crept up her spine, telling herself it was just the storm. She hadn't seen another soul on the trail all evening, which was a relief and a cause for mild concern. There was something about being alone in the woods at night that always made her feel exposed, vulnerable. She had reached the clearing, the one with the old, forgotten cabin, and had decided to head back. That's when she heard it. At first, it was barely perceptible. A soft whispering, like a breath barely escaping a mouth. Lindsay paused, straining to hear, but the sound faded into the wind. She told herself it was just the trees, the rain, the natural sounds of the forest settling. But then she heard it again. This time, it was clearer. Help! Lindsay froze, her heart skipping a beat. The whisper had come from behind her, from deep within the shadows of the trees. She turned, instinctively looking for someone, but saw nothing. The woods were still, save for the rustling leaves in the distance. "Hello?" she called out, her voice steady despite the tension creeping into her chest. There was no answer, just the sound of rain falling heavier now, pelting the leaves with increasing force. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, her feet crunching the damp ground beneath her. The sound of her footsteps seemed to echo louder than they should have, like the forest itself was amplifying the sound, creating an eerie hollow in the night. "Who's there?" she called again, her voice trembling slightly now. Nothing. A chill ran down her spine as she turned back toward the cabin. Her phone had no signal, and the storm had knocked out her car's GPS hours ago. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so lost, both physically and in the unsettling stillness that surrounded her. And that's when she saw it. A figure. Faint, like a shadow at the edge of her vision. At first, it seemed to be a trick of the light, a play of rain and movement. But then it took form, a person, standing between the trees, just barely visible in the darkness. Lindsay's breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, watching her. She blinked, trying to clear her mind, but when her eyes refocused, the figure was gone. Panic surged through her chest. Was it a person? Or had the isolation and fear begun to play tricks on her mind? She knew the answer, deep down. She wasn't alone in the woods. Lindsay began to walk faster, her heart pounding in her chest, each step echoing around her like a drumbeat. She glanced back over her shoulder once, twice, her eyes frantically searching the darkening woods. The figure was gone, but that didn't bring her any comfort. The whispering returned, this time louder. And closer. Help me! Lindsay's pace quickened to a jog, then to a full sprint. The sounds of the forest grew muffled as the pounding of her heart drowned out everything else. The rain began to pour harder, the storm intensifying as if the heavens themselves were reacting to the fear that had settled over her. As she ran, she stumbled over a root, falling to the ground with a painful thud. For a moment, all she could do was lie there, trying to catch her breath, her hands shaking as she wiped the mud from her face. That's when she saw it, a figure emerging from the darkness, stepping into the rain-soaked clearing ahead. This time, there was no mistaking it. A man, dressed in tattered clothes, his face pale and gaunt, standing motionless just beyond the edge of the trees. "Help me!" His voice was hollow, like the sound of someone calling from deep underwater. Lindsay's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. It was as though the air had thickened, trapping her in place. The man took a step forward, his eyes empty, his gaze fixed solely on her. The rain began to fall harder, and with each drop, his figure seemed to become more defined, his movements more deliberate. He was walking toward her now, slowly, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. Lindsay scrambled to her feet, her legs weak, her body numb with fear. She turned and ran, faster than she had ever run in her life. The rain pounded against her skin, the world around her blurring as she sprinted through the storm. She could hear the figure behind her, his footsteps light yet constant, growing closer with every breath. And then, nothing. The footsteps ceased. The whispering stopped. Lindsay dared to look over her shoulder, half expecting to see the man, but there was only darkness. The woods had fallen silent again, except for the rain. She was alone. Or was she? The silence pressed in on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, just out of sight. The whispering had stopped, but the tension in the air remained, thick and suffocating. Lindsay's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. No signal. She was still lost, still alone. The storm showed no signs of letting up. But then, in the distance, she saw a flicker of light. A lantern? A fire? She didn't care. She had to get to it, had to find someone, anyone. She couldn't stay out here any longer. As she made her way toward the light, the whispers returned. "Help me!" But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus. 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, calling out in pain and desperation. The air grew colder, and Lindsay's breath came out in visible puffs, though the storm had made the air feel thick and suffocating. What was it? What was waiting for her out there? Lindsay's feet moved mechanically, guided by the flickering light ahead of her. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as the chorus of whispers seemed to surround her, emanating from the very trees themselves. The wind howled above, mixing with the strange cacophony of voices, making it hard to discern whether they were real or just the wind playing tricks on her mind. Her heart raced as she pushed through the underbrush, her mind consumed with the question, what if it's a trap? Every step she took felt like an eternity. The light, faint but undeniable, grew brighter, casting long shadows across the path ahead. Her muscles ached, her legs felt like lead, but the fear that gripped her kept her moving, pushing her forward. Each time she glanced behind, the dark woods seemed to be swallowing the trail she had left behind, erasing her presence from this forsaken place. Was she being followed? She dared not look again. She couldn't afford the risk. Finally, the source of the light revealed itself, a small shack nestled between the trees, its single lantern swaying in the wind, its glow the only thing breaking through the oppressive darkness. The shack was old, weathered, and nearly hidden by the thick forest that surrounded it. A sense of unease washed over Lindsay as she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The moment she touched the cold metal, the whispers stopped. A profound silence enveloped her, suffocating in its intensity. For a moment, Lindsay stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. She didn't want to go inside, but she didn't feel safe standing there either. The only thing she knew for sure was that she couldn't stay out in the woods. Whatever was out there, whatever had been following her, wasn't going to stop until it had claimed her. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. It creaked loudly on its hinges, as if protesting her intrusion. The inside of the shack was dim, lit only by the flickering light of the lantern. The air smelled musty, damp, and stale, like something had been sealed up in here for years. But there was something else, something far more sinister. A faint, almost imperceptible smell of decay that lingered in the air. Lindsay stepped cautiously inside, her eyes scanning the room. It was small, with a wooden floor that seemed to have been worn down by time. Dust motes floated in the air, caught in the beam of the lantern's light. On the far side of the room stood a rickety old wooden table, cluttered with strange objects, a jar of something that looked like blackened twigs, a bowl of what seemed to be dried leaves, and a small book with a cover so worn it was nearly unreadable. Her eyes lingered on the book. It was out of place in the otherwise desolate room, almost as if someone had left it there for her to find. But before she could approach, a sound broke the silence. A soft, scraping noise, as though something, or someone, was dragging something heavy across the floor above her. Lindsay's breath caught in her throat, her hand instinctively moving toward the door. But it was too late. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the walls, and the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the small shack. Lindsay spun around, panic flooding her chest, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the sound of footsteps echoing from the floor above. There was someone else here. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but the heavy thud of footsteps from above made it impossible to think. The footsteps weren't just ordinary sounds of someone walking. They were slow, deliberate, as if the person knew exactly how to make the sound carry through the walls, drawing Lindsay's attention. "Help!" The voice was low, raspy, and distant, but unmistakable. It was the same voice she had heard in the woods. The same whispering that had followed her since she first stepped onto the trail. Lindsay's blood ran cold. She stepped back, her feet stumbling over the old wooden floor as she backed away from the table, the dark corners of the room seeming to close in on her. She could feel the presence in the room now, like a weight pressing against her chest, suffocating her. And then, as though the air itself had shifted, the footsteps above stopped. Everything grew still once more, as if the house were holding its breath. Lindsay's eyes darted to the door, but she knew she couldn't escape. There was no way out now. And then, as if it had been waiting for the perfect moment, a voice, closer now, almost in her ear, whispered, "Don't run." Lindsay spun around, her heart leaping in her throat, but there was no one there. Nothing. The room was as empty as it had been when she had entered. The only sound now was the pounding of her own heartbeat, and the incessant drumming of rain against the roof. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. The lantern flickered again, this time casting an eerie glow on the far corner of the room. There, standing at the edge of the light, was a figure, a man, hunched and gaunt, his face obscured by shadows. His clothes were ragged, his hands twisted in unnatural positions, as if they were not his own. And then, as if realizing he was being watched, the figure slowly turned toward her, his hollow eyes locking onto hers. "Help me!" The figure rasped, the voice now a low, guttural growl. Lindsay's blood ran cold as she stumbled backward, her mind racing with terror. This wasn't just some figment of her imagination. This was something real. Something that had been waiting for her. And now it was too late to run. The shadows in the room began to move, swirling around her, closing in. She could feel them creeping up her legs, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her closer to the man. The whispering voices returned, louder now, filling her ears with their maddening chorus. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, distorting, closing in as though the house itself was alive, breathing, alive with malice. "Help me!" The voice was no longer just one, now it was hundreds, all speaking at once, filling the room with their desperate pleas. Lindsay's mind raced as she tried to break free, but the shadows had a hold on her now. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The shadows faded away. The voices fell silent. The room was still again, but the sense of dread that lingered in the air was palpable, as though something had been left behind. Lindsay's body shook uncontrollably as she sank to the floor, unable to move, her mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Had it all been a dream? But then she heard it again. A faint whisper, so soft it was barely audible. "Help me!" The voice was coming from the floor beneath her. And it was closer than ever. Lindsay's breath hitched in her throat as the whispering grew louder, closer, coming from beneath her. Her eyes darted to the floor, as if expecting something, someone, to emerge from the old wooden boards. But there was nothing. Just the dust and decay of the shack, the damp air, and the growing weight of the voices that filled her mind. The whispering wasn't just a sound anymore. It had become a presence, something that pressed against her, suffocating her, demanding her attention. Lindsay's chest tightened, and she could feel her heart beating faster, her pulse racing as though she was being hunted. What was this place? The question echoed in her mind, but there was no answer, only the ever-present whispering that surrounded her. She had to get out. She had to escape. Her legs shook as she stood, struggling to find her balance. The floor beneath her creaked ominously as she took a cautious step toward the door. But before she could move any further, the lantern flickered violently, casting long, twisting shadows across the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, stretching, bending, and reaching toward her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The shadows, they weren't just shadows. They were something else. They were the things that had been waiting for her, the things that had followed her into the woods. From the corner of her eye, Lindsay saw movement. A dark figure, barely perceptible, stood in the doorway. She blinked and it was gone, vanished into thin air. "Help me!" The voice came from directly behind her this time, and Lindsay spun around in terror. But there was no one there. The shack was empty, except for her. Her mind raced as she took a step back. Was she going crazy? Was the terror she felt just a figment of her imagination? The shadows, they were real. The voices, they were real. She wasn't alone. The rain outside had turned into a torrential downpour, and the wind howled through the trees, making the shack shake with each gust. The noise outside was deafening, but in the midst of it, there was an undeniable silence inside. A silence that felt unnatural. Lindsay turned her attention back to the old wooden table, the strange objects that had caught her eye earlier. She knew she had to leave, but something about the book on the table called to her. It was like an unspoken invitation, one that she couldn't ignore, no matter how much she wanted to. With trembling hands, Lindsay approached the table, her body stiff with fear. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping with each step she took closer to the book. She could feel the weight of the room pressing against her, but she didn't stop. She reached out and picked up the book. The cover was dark, nearly black, with no visible title or markings. Her fingers brushed against the cover, and the moment they made contact, the room seemed to shudder. The pages inside were brittle, the ink faded, but Lindsay could still make out some words, barely legible. The voices that bind. She flipped through the pages quickly, the dim light from the lantern barely enough to illuminate the writing. The further she went, the more the words made sense to her, a terrifying, ancient text, speaking of entities that thrived in the shadows, that fed off fear and despair, bound to this world by those who had lost their way. Once they have claimed you, there is no escape. They wait, in the dark, in the spaces between worlds. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The whispers, the shadows, the figure she had seen earlier, it wasn't just a person. It was something much older, much darker. Something that had been waiting for her to find this book. Help me! The voice was louder now, almost deafening. Lindsay slammed the book shut, but the sound of the whispers continued, growing in volume and urgency. The shack was shaking now, the walls creaking as if they were being pulled apart. Lindsay felt as though the very foundation of the place was unraveling, as though the house itself were trying to expel her. She backed toward the door, but the latch wouldn't budge. It was stuck, locked from the outside. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it again. The figure. It stood in the far corner of the room, watching her, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Help me! It rasped, its voice a hollow, echoing sound that reverberated through her very bones. Lindsay's heart pounded in her chest as she tried again to open the door. The figure took a step toward her, its face twisted and distorted, as though it were being pulled from the shadows themselves. The whispering became a deafening roar in her ears, overwhelming every thought, drowning out all sense of reality. Her body trembled with fear, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, staring at the figure, unable to look away. It took another step forward. Lindsay screamed and rushed toward the window, slamming her shoulder into it. The glass shattered, but the jagged edges of the window frame were sharp, cutting into her skin. She didn't care. She pushed through, forcing her body out into the storm. The rain drenched her as she tumbled into the mud outside, the wind slapping at her face. She scrambled to her feet, gasping for breath, looking back at the shack. The figure was gone, but the whispering continued, louder than ever, coming from the woods themselves. Lindsay didn't dare look back as she ran. She ran through the storm, through the trees, feeling the mud suck at her shoes, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The whispers, the shadows, the figures, they were closing in, surrounding her, trying to pull her back into the darkness. And then, in the distance, she saw it. The faint glow of headlights. A car. She didn't think. She ran toward it, through the trees, her body screaming in exhaustion. The headlights grew brighter as she stumbled closer, and then, finally, she reached the road. The car screeched to a halt. The door flung open, and a figure stepped out, their silhouette barely visible in the rain. Lindsay collapsed into their arms, too weak to speak. But as the car sped away, taking her far from the woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. The whispering was still there. It was still in her mind. And no matter how far she ran, no matter how fast, it would never let her go. The car sped down the rain-soaked road, its tires slicing through the muddy path as the headlights cut through the storm. Lindsay sat in the passenger seat, her hands trembling, her breath still shallow from the terror she had just endured. The figure beside her, a man who had pulled her from the woods, drove with a sense of urgency, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, but with an edge of concern. Lindsay didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. Every time she tried to speak, the words lodged in her throat. The whispers were still there, echoing in her mind, vibrating against her skull. She could hear them even over the sound of the rain, feel them crawling beneath her skin, like something alive, something relentless. "Help me!" The voice was so close now, as though it was coming from within her own body. She clutched her arms tightly, trying to hold herself together, but the fear threatened to overwhelm her. She had thought she was safe. She had thought that leaving the shack, escaping the figure, had meant she was free. But now, as the man continued to drive, she realized that she wasn't free at all. The storm had grown more intense, the rain pelting the car with such force that the windshield wipers struggled to keep up. The night was thick with darkness, and the road stretched on in front of them, winding through the dense forest. Lindsay could still feel the presence of the woods, the shadows stretching out from the trees as though reaching for her. "Where did you come from?" the man asked, breaking the silence. His voice was hesitant, as if unsure how to address the situation. Lindsay opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a deafening crash rang out from above, followed by a shriek of metal on metal. The car jolted violently, and the headlights flickered. The engine sputtered and stalled. For a moment, the car drifted to the side of the road, its tires skidding on the slick asphalt. "What the hell was that?" the man exclaimed, gripping the wheel tightly. Lindsay's eyes were wide with fear. She turned toward the window, her heart racing. The forest had seemed to close in around them, the trees now pressed against the road like sentinels, their branches heavy with rain, their dark silhouettes looming ominously in the night. And then, in the distance, she saw it. A figure. Lindsay's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the man from the shack. This figure was different, taller, more imposing, its form shadowed by the storm and the darkness. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching them. Its face was hidden, but Lindsay could feel its eyes on her, its presence like a cold breath on the back of her neck. "Who the hell is that?" the man muttered, his eyes flickering between the road and the figure. Lindsay's voice trembled as she finally managed to speak. "We need to go. Now." She wasn't sure how she knew, but she could feel it. There was something wrong about this place, something unnatural. The woods had become a prison, and this figure, whatever it was its warden. Before the man could respond, The car engine let out a final sputter and died completely. No, 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 the man cursed under his breath, trying the ignition again, but there was no response. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Lindsay's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of the figure's gaze, its presence drawing closer. She turned back to the woods and saw it, a movement, unnatural and swift, like something darting between the trees. The figure was coming toward them. "Get out," she whispered, panic seizing her chest. "We have to run." The man looked at her, his expression blank with confusion, but as he turned back toward the woods, his eyes widened. The figure was moving faster now, its silhouette shifting through the trees, its limbs twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, but before he could make a move, Lindsay threw open the door. She didn't care about the rain, the cold, or the fact that she had no idea where she was going. She just had to get away. She bolted into the woods, her feet slipping on the slick ground, her mind consumed with only one thought: run. Behind her, the man called out, but his voice was swallowed by the storm, drowned out by the sound of her own frantic footsteps. She could hear the figure now, moving behind her, closer than before, its breath sharp and unnatural. The whispers were louder than ever. "Help me!" The voice wasn't just one anymore. It was a chorus, a multitude of voices, overlapping and distorted, all coming from the shadows. She could feel them closing in, their presence pressing down on her as the darkness seemed to grow deeper around her. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. She just kept running, the ground beneath her feet slippery with mud and rain. Her breath came in ragged gasps as her legs burned with exhaustion, but still, she pushed forward, her mind screaming for escape. "Help me!" The voice was clearer now, and it wasn't just in her mind. It was real. It was all around her. It was everywhere. Lindsay stumbled, falling to the ground, her body aching as she tried to push herself up. But before she could stand, a cold, twisted hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing her ankle and yanking her back into the forest. Her scream was cut off as she was dragged through the mud, her nails scraping against the wet ground. The figure was there, its form now fully revealed, a creature that was neither man nor beast, its limbs unnaturally long, its face a horrific mask of twisted features. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its mouth twisted into an awful grin, its teeth sharp and jagged. "Help me!" The voice was coming from it now, or maybe from the very trees themselves. Lindsay's eyes darted around, but all she could see were shadows. The woods had become a nightmare, a maze of darkness with no way out. The creature pulled her deeper into the forest, its grip unyielding, its movements impossibly fast. She could hear the whispers again, louder now, like 1,000 voices crying out in unison. And then, through the fog of panic and fear, something shifted in her mind. She realized the truth. She wasn't just running from the creature. She was running from herself. The whispers, the shadows, the figures, they were all a part of her. She had been brought here by her own fear, her own desperation, and now there was no escape. The shadows were closing in, and she was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. And in the distance, through the trees, the faint light of the shack flickered, waiting for her return. Lindsay's chest heaved as she struggled against the creature's grip, her limbs moving in frantic desperation, but it was no use. The shadowy figure's hands were like iron, pulling her through the damp forest with an inhuman strength. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, brushing against her skin with an eerie coldness. The whispers surrounded her, the voices growing louder, almost deafening, as though they were part of the wind itself, each word wrapping around her consciousness like a vice. "Help me!" The words were not just in her ears anymore. They were inside her mind, echoing through her thoughts, scratching at the edges of her sanity. She could feel her grip on reality beginning to slip, her heart racing as terror flooded her system. The creature's face loomed over her, its twisted features unreadable in the dim light of the storm. Its eyes were hollow, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light, and as it opened its mouth, the whispers grew into a cacophony of agony and despair. It spoke, but its voice was not human. It was a guttural, rasping sound that reverberated through her body like a tremor. "You are not meant to escape, child. You are one of us now." Lindsay's blood ran cold. Her mind raced as she tried to comprehend what the creature meant, but there was no time to think. The grip on her ankle tightened, and she was dragged further into the depths of the forest. With all her strength, she twisted her body, kicking out, and managing to land a blow to the creature's side. It shrieked in pain, a high-pitched wail that made the very air around her shudder. For a brief moment, the creature released its hold, and Lindsay scrambled to her feet, her legs shaky from fear and exhaustion. She didn't know which direction she was going, but she ran. She ran as fast as her legs would carry her, stumbling over roots and branches, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The forest seemed alive, its shadows shifting, moving, closing in around her with every step. She could still hear the whispers, but now they weren't just behind her, they were everywhere. Inside her, around her, filling the very air she breathed. "Help me!" It was the voice she had heard before, the voice that had led her into the woods, the voice that had never left her. The creature was not just a thing in the forest. It was part of the woods themselves, and they were calling her, pulling her back to where she had come from. Her mind began to fracture under the weight of the voices, but she pushed on, ignoring the pain in her body, ignoring the exhaustion that threatened to collapse her. She had to get away. She couldn't let herself be consumed by whatever this was. Suddenly, the forest opened up ahead of her. A clearing. She had never been here before, but something about it felt familiar. In the center of the clearing stood the shack. The very same shack she had fled from earlier. The lantern still flickered dimly, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. Her heart lurched. No. She hadn't been running forward. She had been running in circles, drawn back to the very place she had tried to escape. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. She could feel the coldness of the air around her, the dampness of the earth beneath her feet, the weight of the presence in the woods pressing in on her chest. The voices, they were everywhere. "Please," Lindsay whispered to herself, her voice hoarse, her body trembling as she took a step toward the shack. The whispers seemed to follow her every movement, and the shadow of the creature was there again, standing just outside the clearing, watching her with those unblinking, hollow eyes. And then, before she knew it, she was inside. The door creaked shut behind her, the familiar scent of musty decay filling her nostrils. The shadows of the room seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways, closing in on her as though the very walls were alive. The lantern flickered once again, casting its dim light over the room, illuminating the objects on the table. She turned, panic rising in her chest, as she saw the book lying there, The same book she had found earlier, the one that had spoken of voices that bound, of entities trapped between worlds. It was open now, its pages fluttering in an unseen breeze. Lindsay stepped toward the table, her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't stop herself. Her fingers hovered over the pages, and as if in response, the book seemed to pulse with a strange energy. The words blurred in front of her eyes, but one sentence stood out, carved into the paper like a warning. Once you've come here, you can never leave. You are bound to the shadows, forever. She felt the weight of those words in her soul, the finality of them. The air in the room seemed to press in on her chest, her breathing growing shallow as she felt the pull of the shadows again, this time stronger than ever. From behind her, the figure was there, its breath cold against her skin. Lindsay turned slowly, her body frozen in place, and faced the creature once more. It stepped forward, its form now fully visible, its distorted limbs twitching unnaturally. The whispers were a cacophony in her mind now, drowning out every other thought, filling her with dread. You belong here, it whispered in that guttural voice, its face inches from hers. Lindsay's heart hammered against her ribs, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse under the weight of it all. The creature's eyes seemed to pierce her very soul, and the whispers, the voices, they weren't just the shadows anymore, they were her own thoughts, her own fears, whispering of her inevitable fate. Help me! But this time, the voice was not one of the creatures. It wasn't a voice that came from the forest. It wasn't even a voice that came from the shack. It was her own. And with that realization, Lindsay understood. She wasn't running from the shadows. She had been running from herself all along. The forest, the creature, the whispers, they were all parts of her, reflections of the darkness within her own soul. She had tried to escape, tried to outrun them, but in the end, there was nowhere to go. She was already lost. Lindsay stood frozen in the middle of the shack, her legs trembling beneath her as the realization sank deep into her bones. The darkness that surrounded her wasn't just the forest, the creature, or the whispers, they were fragments of herself, manifestations of her own terror, guilt, and regret. All the things she had tried to outrun, all the parts of her that she had buried deep inside, now lived here in the shadows. The creature, no, it wasn't a creature at all, moved closer, its twisted, elongated form a grotesque reflection of her own fear. It was her. It was everything she had been running from. Help me! Lindsay whispered again, but this time it wasn't just a plea for rescue. It was an acceptance, a broken surrender to what she had become. The shadows shifted around her, wrapping themselves like tendrils, pulling her in closer. The whispers that once seemed like a chorus of otherworldly voices now felt like her own thoughts, speaking in a language she couldn't ignore. You belong here. You cannot escape. Lindsay's breath came in ragged gasps, and for the first time since entering the woods, she understood what had been happening. She hadn't just stumbled across the shack. She had been drawn here, bound by the same darkness that had followed her for so long. It wasn't the forest or the creature, it was her mind, unraveling, pulling her deeper into a place she couldn't escape from. The walls of the shack felt like they were closing in around her, the air growing thicker with each passing second. She looked around, trying to find any means of escape, but there was nothing. No door, no window, just the darkness closing in. But then, in the corner of the room, she saw something. A faint glimmer of light. It was the lantern on the table, its flickering flame casting shadows on the walls. And then, As if in response to her gaze, the light grew brighter, intensifying as though it was alive. The flame danced wildly, casting long, writhing shadows across the shack, and in the light, something began to emerge. A figure. Not the creature, not the twisted shadow from the woods, but something else. Something familiar. Lindsay squinted through the haze of fear, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure was tall, its form slowly becoming clearer in the growing light. A woman. Her face was soft, her features kind, and she was standing in the doorway of the shack. "Lindsay," the woman whispered, her voice gentle but filled with an undeniable sadness. Lindsay's heart skipped a beat as she recognized her. It was her mother. But how? Her mother had died years ago. She had died in a car accident, a tragic event that had shattered Lindsay's world, leaving her with a wound that had never healed. Since then, Lindsay had tried to bury the pain, to push it down, but it had always been there, lingering, waiting for a moment like this to resurface. Lindsay's chest tightened as she took a step forward. Her voice was a broken whisper, barely audible. "Mom." The woman's face twisted, her expression shifting from sorrow to something darker, more sorrowful, yet full of love. "You need to let go, Lindsay," her mother's voice echoed in the shack. "You can't run from yourself anymore." Lindsay felt a wave of emotion crash over her, grief, guilt, despair. The pain she had carried for so long suddenly flooded to the surface, overwhelming her. The years of pretending she was fine, of denying the things that haunted her, it all came rushing back. She wasn't running from shadows. She had been running from the grief of losing her mother. The anger. The unanswered questions. "You've been trying to escape for too long," her mother continued, her voice breaking. "But you can't escape from the darkness inside you. It's time to face it. Time to accept that it's a part of who you are." Lindsay felt a deep ache in her chest, a weight she had been carrying for years. She had thought she could outrun it, that by ignoring the pain, by distracting herself, she could find peace. But now, as she stood in the shack with the whispers of her past echoing around her, she knew that the only way forward was to confront everything she had been avoiding. "I'm sorry," Lindsay choked out, the tears that had been welling up finally spilling over, cascading down her face. I never meant to leave you behind." Her mother's expression softened, a look of understanding in her eyes. "You never left me, Lindsay. I've always been with you. The pain you feel, the shadows you see, it's all a reflection of the love you still carry. You can't outrun love. You have to learn to live with it, to let it heal you." As Lindsay stood there, trembling in the middle of the shack, the darkness around her began to shift. The oppressive weight of the shadows that had once surrounded her slowly began to lift, dissipating like fog in the morning light. The whispers that had been so loud, so overwhelming, grew softer, fainter, until they were nothing more than a distant hum. For the first time in a long while, Lindsay felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Her mother smiled gently, her form beginning to fade as if she were being absorbed into the light of the lantern. "You're free now, Lindsay," her mother's voice said one last time, full of warmth and love. "Remember, it's okay to let go." And with that, her mother was gone. Lindsay stood alone in the shack, her heart still racing, but now filled with a sense of clarity. The forest around her had fallen silent. The rain had stopped. The oppressive weight of fear and grief had lifted. She had faced the darkness within her. She had faced her past. And now, for the first time in years, Lindsay felt ready to move forward. As she stepped outside, the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, illuminating the forest in soft, golden rays. The world seemed quieter, gentler. The shadows no longer felt like enemies, but part of the landscape she could walk through. Lindsay took a deep breath, her heart lighter than it had ever been. She didn't need to run anymore. She didn't need to escape. The shadows in the woods were gone, and in their place, there was peace. As Lindsay stepped out of the shack, the early light of dawn broke through the canopy of trees, casting long rays across the forest floor. The air was crisp, and the world felt impossibly still. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sense of quiet serenity. It was as if everything had reset, the storm purging the woods of the heaviness that had once defined them. But even as the last remnants of darkness faded into the distance, something in Lindsay's chest still fluttered with uncertainty. The peace she had found was fragile, like a delicate thread she feared might snap at any moment. She had confronted the shadows within her, faced the grief and the pain that had haunted her, but the question still lingered. Had she truly left them behind? She glanced back at the shack, which now appeared smaller, more insignificant than before. The whispers that had once filled the air now seemed distant, their echoes fading into the wind. But there was something else, something lurking in the farthest reaches of the woods. A flicker of movement at the edge of her vision, just beyond the trees. Lindsay stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. She turned quickly, scanning the forest, her heart skipping a beat. There was nothing there. Just the wind rustling the leaves, the birds calling out in the distance, the soft chirp of insects in the wet earth. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. Not the shadows, not the creature, but something far more insidious. Her legs felt heavy, but she forced herself to walk, one foot in front of the other, making her way through the woods. The forest was beautiful now, serene and peaceful. The path ahead of her, once overgrown and twisting, now seemed clear. But the nagging sensation of being followed clung to her like a shadow. It was as if the forest itself were still holding its breath, waiting for her to make a mistake. And then, out of nowhere, the sound returned. The whispering. Soft at first, like a breeze through the trees, but then louder, clearer. It wasn't the voice of the creature. It wasn't her mother's comforting words. This voice was something darker. Come back. Lindsay stopped in her tracks, her body tensing. The voice was familiar, but not in the way she wanted it to be. It wasn't a memory from her past. It wasn't an echo of the shack. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for her to leave, to let her guard down. She turned toward the sound, her heartbeat pounding in her chest. The voice was clearer now, almost like it was coming from beneath the earth itself, rising from the depths of the ground. Come back to the shadows. The words were so clear now that Lindsay could almost feel them vibrating through her body. The whispering wasn't just in her ears, it was in her bones, in her very soul. Help me. The words were a plea. The voice sounded desperate, but there was a coldness to it that made her shiver. It wasn't the warmth she had felt when her mother spoke. It wasn't the love that had comforted her. This was something darker, pulling her back, urging her to return to the shack, to the place where the shadows lived. Lindsay's feet felt like they were rooted to the spot. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. Her mind swirled with the echoes of the past, the terror, the grief, all coming back to haunt her in this moment. The trees around her seemed to shift, their trunks bending, stretching toward her as though they were reaching out with twisted arms. The forest had changed again, the peacefulness now replaced by a creeping sense of dread. The path ahead of her had dissolved into a maze of thick underbrush, the trail lost to the shadows once more. Her chest tightened as the whispering grew louder, clearer, now coming from every direction. Come back, come back. Lindsay took a hesitant step forward, but before she could go further, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. A man, tall and dark, his face obscured by the shadows that surrounded him. He stepped into the light of the early dawn, his eyes glowing faintly, and a chilling smile crept across his lips. You can't escape it, he said in a voice that seemed to curl around her, binding her in place. The darkness is a part of you now, Lindsay. There is no going back. Lindsay's breath caught in her throat. The man's voice was unsettling, and his presence felt wrong, as though he were a part of the forest itself. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for her. The whispers grew louder still, the words becoming a tangled mess of pleas and demands, each one pulling at her, urging her to surrender. The shadows behind the man seemed to ripple, darkening, swirling as if alive. You've been marked, the man continued, his smile widening. The forest has claimed you, and now, you must return to it. Lindsay's heart pounded in her chest, but deep down, she knew that this moment had been coming. The shadows, the whispers, the creature in the woods, it was all a part of her, a part of what she had been trying to outrun. And now, the forest was here to collect. She could feel the coldness of the shadows creeping toward her, feel the weight of them pressing in from every direction. She could feel them inside her, beneath her skin, in her very soul. She had thought she could escape them. She had thought the light of dawn would bring peace, but it hadn't. The darkness wasn't something that could be outrun. It was something that had been waiting for her to return. The man took another step forward, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. Come with me. Embrace what you are. There is no escape from the shadows. You belong to them now. The words hung in the air like a spell, wrapping around her mind, threatening to break her. But Lindsay stood still, refusing to let the fear consume her again. No. I won't go back. The strength of that thought hit her like a wave, pushing against the darkness. For a moment, she saw a flicker of light again, the soft glow of the morning sun breaking through the trees. It was weak, fragile, but it was enough. She took a deep breath, gathering her strength. The whispering faded for a brief second, and in that silence, she knew what she had to do. She turned away from the figure, from the voice, from the shadows. She didn't need to escape the woods again, she needed to face them. She needed to face the darkness within herself. I am not what you say I am. I am not bound to you. Lindsay took a step forward, then another, and with each movement, the darkness seemed to recede just a little more. The shadows in the forest pulled back, as if confused by her refusal to give in. The whispers became quieter, then silent, as she walked toward the clearing where the sun now broke through the canopy. She was no longer running. No longer trapped in a world of whispers and shadows. She was free. And this time, she was never going back. Lindsay continued to walk through the forest, the golden light of dawn now filling the air, scattering the last of the shadows that had once clung to the trees. She could still hear the wind rustling through the leaves, but the whispers had finally quieted. The oppressive weight that had followed her for so long, the ever-present pull of darkness, was now nothing more than a distant memory. As she moved further away from the shack, each step felt lighter, her breath steadier. The forest no longer seemed like an enemy. The trees, once towering and intimidating, now stood as quiet witnesses to her journey. She wasn't running from them anymore. She wasn't running from herself. For the first time, Lindsay understood. The darkness had never been something external. It had been a part of her, a shadow of grief, fear, and loss that she had tried to outrun for so long. But now, she had embraced it, accepted it as a part of who she was. It didn't define her. It was just another piece of the whole. Her eyes lifted to the sky as the clouds broke apart, revealing the vastness of the morning sky. The warmth of the sun kissed her skin, and for the first time, she felt truly free. Free from the whispers. Free from the shadows. Free from the past that had haunted her. She had faced what she feared most, not the creatures in the forest, not the ghost of her mother, but the grief she had carried for years. And in doing so, she had found peace. It was a peace that came not from escaping the darkness, but from walking through it, understanding that it would always be there. But it didn't have to control her. Lindsay smiled softly to herself, the weight on her heart finally lifting. The forest was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary, a place where she had found the strength to stand tall, to embrace both the light and the dark, and to move forward. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long beams through the trees, Lindsay knew that the journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt. But she was no longer afraid. She had faced her fears, and she had found her way back to herself. And with that, she stepped forward, leaving the whispers behind her, walking into a future she could finally embrace. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.